So why should we care about Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories? Well, if you're a U.S. citizen like I am, or a citizen of the world who cares about the actions of a powerful country, then you should care. The United States supports Israel in a number of ways. It vetoes UN Security Council resolutions calling on Israel to abide by international law. The U.S. government allows companies to sell modern weapons to Israel even when it violates human rights. And the U.S. finances Israel with loan guarantees, and since 1976, the biggest portion of our foreign aid budget. Israel is the single biggest recipient of our foreign aid. Now, the American Foreign Assistance Act of 1962 mandates that our aid money be used to support basic human rights. These are the rights to food, clothing, shelter, democracy, justice, economic prosperity, and education. This concept of human rights developed from international struggles and also from movements in the U.S., like the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and worker struggles. These human rights have been written down in international treaties. They represent a basic morality agreed on by all cultures. And even when honored more in the breach than the observance, these human rights are supported by people everywhere, and they're a basic American value. So let's use the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act to analyze Israel's actions and help us understand what's happening in the occupied territories. First of all, is Israel providing shelter to Palestinians? Unfortunately, Israel has actually demolished more than 10,000 homes since 1967 when it occupied the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Israel uses rockets to destroy homes or whole apartment blocks, or sometimes Israeli soldiers drive specially armored American-built Caterpillar bulldozers, like the one in 2003, which crushed to death 23-year-old American Rachel Corrie, who was nonviolently trying to prevent a Palestinian home from being destroyed. Israel offers various justifications for these house demolitions. It says that Palestinians lack permits to build extensions on their homes, but these permits are expensive to apply for and rarely granted. Or Israel will claim that there's been resistance by someone in the neighborhood. But when these homes are destroyed, all of the family members lose their home. Usually 10 to 20 people live in each extended family home. Punishing all of them for an individual's action is called collective punishment. Collective punishment is prohibited in our own country's laws, and it's prohibited under international law as well. In this case, the international law is the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are also known as the Laws of War and Occupation, or humanitarian law. They were developed after the Nazi Holocaust and occupation of Europe during World War II. The conventions have been signed by most countries, including Israel and the U.S. Israeli collective punishment of Palestinians by demolishing their homes violates Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Once Israeli soldiers have demolished a Palestinian home, the family must live in tents, or move in with relatives, or become refugees seeking shelter in another country. Even though international law says refugees have a right to return to their homes as soon as possible, some Palestinians have been refugees and unable to return since 1948 or 1967, and more Palestinians are being forced to leave every year. Israeli authorities then often confiscate the land on which the Palestinian home had stood, and they finance the building of beautiful settlement towns. Most settlements are built on the most fertile land in the West Bank with the most wells. They sit on top of hills, and their sewage drains onto Palestinian villages below. The Israeli government encourages Israeli settlers to move into the occupied territories by subsidizing settler homes and building settler-only highways on more confiscated land to connect the settlements to Israel. Only Jewish Israelis may settle in Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Settlers are armed by the government and protected by the government. Settlers are allowed to beat and shoot at Palestinians, usually with impunity and while being covered by the army. If settlers are brought into court for their crimes, they're subject to domestic Israeli law with many protections, whereas Palestinians accused of the same crime are subject to Israeli martial law with few protections and harsher penalties for the same offenses. Settlers keep Palestinians from their own land, they prevent harvests, they keep animals from grazing, and destroy Palestinian crops and trees. Settlers raid Palestinian towns at night, shooting at rooftop water tanks, vandalizing property, and blocking roads with dirt and boulders. When I lived in the occupied territories, working as a lawyer for a human rights organization, I witnessed all of this behavior myself. In Khalil, Hebron, settlers live in the middle of a Palestinian town. They prevent Palestinians from reaching their homes at night or from going to school and work in the morning. So far, Israel has built over 150 settlements where only Jewish Israelis can live, and has transferred over 450,000 settlers into the occupied territories, including 200,000 into East Jerusalem. Although it removed some settlers from Gaza in 2005, Israel added even more in the West Bank during the same time. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention clearly prohibits the transfer of the occupying population into occupied areas, or the transfer of the occupied population out of the areas. In fact, international law forbids any taking of territory by force and calls on occupiers to withdraw quickly. So the fact that Israel has occupied the territory since 1967 makes the entire occupation highly illegal. Israel has now built a wall, 89% of which runs not along the Green Line border between Israel and the occupied territories, but inside the West Bank. The wall does not separate Israelis from Palestinians, as sometimes claimed. It separates Palestinians from each other. Building this barrier, usually over 20 feet high, has uprooted tens of thousands of trees, separated Palestinian farmers from their own farmland, and divided Palestinian towns and neighbors from each other. The wall has de facto annexed onto the Israeli side of the wall about 20% of the West Bank, including the most fertile land, the major West Bank water aquifers, and over half of the settlers. Altogether, settlements, settler roads, and the wall have confiscated about 40% of the West Bank. In 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled the route of the wall illegal. It said that the wall and settlements severely impeded the Palestinian right to self-determination, and it ordered Israel to remove the wall and pay reparations for the damage done. The court also reiterated that settlements are illegal, and it stated that no other country should aid Israel in maintaining the wall, and that all states which had signed the Geneva Conventions, which would include the U.S., had a duty to ensure Israel's compliance with the conventions. This makes the U.S. legally responsible to pressure Israel to remove settlers, settlements, and the wall. Yet Israel continues to build the wall, build the settlements, and encourage settlers to move into the occupied territories. So instead of providing shelter to Palestinians with U.S. aid money, as mandated by the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, Israel is demolishing Palestinian homes, collectively punishing whole families, confiscating their land for later settlement by Israeli settlers, and leaving Palestinians no choice but to leave and become internal or external refugees. Taken together, this amounts to a policy of gradual ethnic cleansing, a purposeful policy to remove an ethnicity through intimidation, force, violence, or terror, usually to make the area ethnically homogeneous. According to international law, ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. In this case, Palestinians are being removed in order to make land and water available for Israeli settlers. How about democracy? Does Israel provide this to Palestinians, as required by the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act? We usually think of democracy as involving the right to vote and be governed by our representatives. But for many years, Palestinians couldn't vote for anyone other than mayor. Since the mid-1990s Oslo Accord, Palestinians can vote for a president and parliament, the Palestinian Authority. But under the same Oslo Accords, Israel has the right to veto any of the laws made by the Palestinian Authority, and the right to enter the West Bank and Gaza with its army anytime it wants. So who really makes the laws that govern the Palestinian people? The Israeli government appoints a military commander who issues military orders that control Palestinian activities. There are thousands of these Israeli military laws. They control Palestinian land, water, electricity, borders, immigration, and economy. The Israeli military commander decides when to invade the occupied territories and which Palestinians to search, jail, or assassinate. Yet no Palestinian has the right to vote in Israeli elections. No Palestinian has the right to choose the government that appoints the military commander that rules their lives. Ironically, Palestinians have a very democratic society at the grassroots level. They've developed committees that coordinate workers, prisoners, women's issues, education, human rights issues, and agriculture. At the grassroots level, Palestinian society promotes the rule of law and human rights. But Israel and the Oslo Accords have given a false sense that Palestinians have a government with real power in the occupied territories. The relatively powerless Palestinian Authority has created a destructive elite an armed police force whose real mandate is to control Palestinians on behalf of Israel. The Palestinian Authority protects Israel from resistance to occupation, but has no power or mandate to protect Palestinians from harmful occupation. Israel's divide and rule policy focuses world attention on problems with supposed Palestinian democracy, when there really isn't a democracy, and it diverts attention from the real problems of ethnic cleansing and occupation. Of course, when Palestinians do have elections, and they elect a group strong on resistance or public works like Hamas, then Israel, the U.S., and many other countries refuse to recognize a democratically elected party, and they collectively punish the whole Palestinian population through blockades, sieges, and withholding aid. So far from allowing any democracy under its rule, as called for by the American Foreign Assistance Act, Israel has imposed a military dictatorship. Does Israel provide justice to Palestinians? Does it treat them fairly and equally? As I mentioned before, Israeli settlers are subject to Israeli civil law, while Palestinians, who might live very nearby, are subject to Israeli martial law. There's one color license plate for Palestinians, a different color for settlers. There are roads for Palestinians, but better and bigger roads for settlers. Palestinians are treated differently in many other ways as well. Palestinians must carry IDs with them at all times. These are color-coded to tell who's been in prison, with former prisoners treated worse by Israeli soldiers. Palestinians are subject to searches by Israeli authorities at any time. Their homes may be searched at any time. No warrants are required for searches or arrests. Israeli soldiers can detain Palestinians without charge or trial for 6 months at a time, renewable for years. Currently, there are thousands of Palestinians under this kind of administrative detention in special wings of Israeli prisons. In prison, over 80% of all Palestinians are tortured. In 1997, the United Nations found that Israel had violated the Convention Against Torture. Torture is also prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention, which makes torture a war crime. Unlike administrative detainees, some Palestinians do get a trial, but not a fair one. Trials have few safeguards for the prisoner. There's no presumption of innocence. There may be no interpreter from Hebrew to Arabic. Army lawyers usually offer secret evidence against the prisoner, which the prisoner and his or her lawyer are not allowed to see, and the judge is a member of the army. Often the Israeli army doesn't even try to arrest someone it thinks is resisting the occupation. Instead, soldiers receive targeted assassination orders, or they kidnap a person and expel him from the occupied territories without a hearing. This is expulsion, or the death penalty, without any trial whatsoever. Let me expand on this Israeli use of force, often lethal force, on Palestinians. First, Israel often claims it's shooting or bombing in self-defense. This claim is not legitimate. Under international law, occupations must be short and cannot be used as an excuse to acquire territory. Yet Israel has been occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1967 and is building settlements and roads on that land. Therefore, Israel's occupation is illegal. When you're the aggressor, you cannot claim self-defense. All people under occupation have the right to resist it. We would want this right too. When Palestinians resist occupation, the proper course of action for Israel would be to end its occupation, not bomb the occupied territories and claim self-defense. The second point with regard to Israel's use of force is that as long as it occupies Palestinian land, Israel is under an obligation to treat its people humanely. When there is resistance, Israel is bound to react like a law enforcement agency, like the police, not like the army in a war. The UN Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials and other international standards clarify that police forces must respond to disruption with humanity, proportionality, and use force only when absolutely necessary. But it's been well documented by Israeli and international human rights organizations that Israeli authorities have issued open fire regulations to their soldiers which don't comport with these international standards. They allow shooting to kill even when soldiers are not in life-threatening danger, and even when the other person has no weapon. This was especially obvious and well documented during the 2002 invasion of Jenin and the 2008-2009 invasion of Gaza, when soldiers fired deliberately on civilians, including small children. These open fire regulations are just one example of the disproportionate and unnecessary use of force applied by the Israeli army against Palestinian civilians and resistance fighters. When Israel applies its unnecessary, disproportionate force, It often uses American-made weapons, such as American fighter jets, military helicopters, and missiles, built by Boeing, Sikorsky, Lockheed Martin, and others. So the sale of such American weapons to a country with an illegally long occupation, which has repeatedly violated international law by using disproportionate force, torture, and ethnic cleansing, violates our U.S. Arms Export Control Act. The U.S. Arms Export Control Act says, and I quote, that no security assistance may be provided to any country, the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. In 2002, the U.S. State Department announced that it was monitoring Israeli use of American weapons for this reason. Israel also uses weapons such as flechette tank shells, white phosphorus, and dense inert metal explosives in an illegal way by unleashing them in densely populated areas where the weaponry wounds and kills both civilians and resistance fighters, and where they hit hospitals, schools, houses of worship, and UN buildings. Failure to discriminate between civilians and fighters, the use of human shields, as well as the deliberate obstruction of medical care for the wounded, both after conflicts with resistors and at checkpoints, are all expressly prohibited by the laws of war and occupation. Every death of a person is a tragedy. Comparing numbers of dead sometimes obscures this. But if terrorism is defined as violence against civilians for a political purpose, then it's obvious that Israel has committed by far the majority of the terrorist acts in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, since Israel has killed thousands more Palestinians, mostly civilians, than Palestinians have killed Israeli civilians or soldiers. In fact, Israel asks its soldiers to commit so many illegal and immoral acts that many Israeli soldiers refuse to serve again in the occupied territories. These Israeli soldiers have given detailed evidence of abuses which they and their comrades perpetrated, publishing photographs they took of prisoner and civilian abuse. However, many other soldiers continue to serve in the Israeli military, because in Israeli society, military service is mandatory for men and women. It's a social rite of passage, and there are many economic opportunities unavailable to refusers or conscientious objectors. So Israel has actually created an ethnically based set of laws and practices, sustained by the whole state system, where one ethnicity is preferred, and the other ethnicity has no citizenship and no vote, except in Bantustans or ghettos. This ethnicity must carry special IDs and live in segregated residential areas, and this ethnicity is subject to land confiscation, a marginalized economy on the worst land, administrative detention, states of emergency, and harsh martial law. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu of South Africa have called Israel's occupation apartheid. Thus, far from providing justice as the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act demands, Israel has created a system of apartheid. In this case, the Israeli government is guilty of crimes against humanity, since both apartheid and torture constitute such crimes if they're part of a systematic practice by government policy. The American Foreign Assistance Act also calls on a country using its aid to promote economic prosperity and education. So does Israel provide this? Unfortunately, Israel is making the opposite happen. Since 1967, Israel has pursued an intentional policy of de-developing the economy and infrastructure of the occupied territories. De-development means that the economy is worse off now than in 1967 when the occupation started, even though other countries all around the West Bank and Gaza Strip are better off. Israel has many reasons for de-development, so that the occupied territories won't compete with Israeli products, so Palestinians can be available as low-paid laborers inside Israel when needed, or to build settlements or work in settlement sweatshops inside the occupied territories, and so that Palestinians will give up and leave the region. Israel pursues de-development in many ways. Israel has prohibited the growing of anything without a permit, which is usually unavailable. Israel restricts crops and limits factory sizes. Israeli settlement industrial zones in the occupied territories employ Palestinians as cheap sweatshop labor and pollute the surrounding air and land. Wages in the occupied territories are about a quarter what they are in Israel, while the cost of living is almost the same as in Israel. Israel controls electricity and charges high prices for it. Israel dumps poor quality, cheap products on the occupied territories market to undercut Palestinian products. Israel restricts water by forbidding the digging of new wells, confiscating land and its wells to give to settlers, allowing pollution of existing water tables through unregulated toxic runoff from settlement industrial zones, and controlling the water to many major towns and only turning on water once or twice a week. There's a chronic water shortage in the West Bank. Palestinian average per capita consumption of water is only 2/3 the minimum amount needed, according to the World Health Organization. By contrast, Israeli per capita consumption is 3.5 times higher than Palestinian intake. 2/3 of the water that Israelis consume is taken from water aquifers shared with Palestinians but controlled completely by Israel. When Palestinians have to buy water from the Israeli water company, they pay higher rates than Israelis, and settlements consume a disproportionate amount of the water in the West Bank. In Gaza, the problem is quality. Only 7% of the water in the Gaza Strip meets the World Health Organization standards, mainly because Gaza relies on water aquifers underneath Israeli soil, which are being depleted solely for the benefit of Israel. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Israel ratified, says that Israel must ensure access to clean drinking water without discrimination, but it doesn't seem to be doing that. Israel also ensures de-development by restricting all the borders, ports, and airspace of the occupied territories. Thus, it restricts Palestinian access to any goods other than Israeli ones, and restricts Palestinian movement, trade, and ability to travel. In Gaza recently, Israel has maintained a blockade that severely restricts Gazan access to food, water, electricity, goods, and fuel. In its many invasions of Gaza, Israel has smashed any infrastructure that Gazans managed to build. This is why it's clear that Israel is still the occupier of Gaza, even when its soldiers and settlers are not physically inside Gaza. Israel is still in complete control of Gaza, controls its access to all important resources, and can enter it any time it wishes. So international law considers Israel to be still responsible for Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel has brought most of the Palestinian economy and society to a standstill by crisscrossing the occupied territories with Israeli-only settlements, settler roads, over 100 permanent and flying checkpoints, and over 500 roadblocks and earth mounds on Palestinian roads. In addition, there are closed military zones and nature reserves, which are usually pretexts for later land confiscation to build settlements. All this means that Palestinians can't get to work, home, school, hospital, or a house of worship with any predictability or regularity, because the relatively tiny West Bank has been carved up into hundreds of separate enclaves. Sometimes whole towns are closed, with no one allowed in or out, like miniature versions of the siege on Gaza. This is especially the case with East Jerusalem, a part of the West Bank that Israel has illegally annexed. Unless Palestinians are residents of East Jerusalem, they're almost never allowed to enter it. Israel has systematically pursued a policy of refusing families the right to unify in East Jerusalem. This means that many East Jerusalem Palestinians must move to another part of the West Bank if they want to live with their non-East Jerusalem resident spouses. Sometimes Israel imposes a curfew on a village or town, meaning no one can leave their homes. Palestinians must stay indoors for days or weeks. If they're lucky, they may receive permission to leave home for an hour to shop every few days, but often the shops are mostly bare because no delivery trucks have made it through the curfews and checkpoints. With curfews, checkpoints, invasions, attacks on city centers with tear gas and bullets, obviously education is often a victim. Children miss dozens of school days a year. It takes an average of 7 years to go through college for a Palestinian youth, not 4. Not only does this create an undereducated class, as Israel may intend, but it leads to many angry youths on the streets because they can't be in school and eager to rise up against injustice. Still, Palestinians pride themselves on being a very educated population. They greatly value their education and have often defied military orders by setting up underground schools and community centers of learning during curfews and closures. With all of these economic problems brought on by occupation, Palestinians can only survive in the occupied territories through the kindness of neighbors, aid from abroad when Israel lets it through, and remittances from relatives abroad. Clearly, this is not a viable, sustainable economy or society. Unemployment is always astronomically high, often ranging from 30 to 80%. 2 people of every 3 live under the poverty line, and 1 in 5 children is chronically malnourished, according to international organizations like CARE. Palestinians have, or should have, the right to utilize and enjoy freely their natural resources. They have a right to liberty of movement, guaranteed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They have a right to health, work, education, and an adequate standard of living, guaranteed by various international laws, including the UN Charter. But the way that Israel controls water, land, and the economy violates Israel's duty to ensure public order and safety without discrimination in the occupied territories. Israel's way of governing the occupied territories clearly violates its duty under the Geneva Conventions and earlier Hague regulations to govern for the benefit of the occupied population, a right every one of us would want under occupation. So far from promoting economic prosperity and education, as required by the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, the Israeli authorities have intentionally created a complete lack of economic or educational opportunity. They've created unemployment, poverty, and hunger. So what we would like, and what our laws mandate, is that our foreign aid goes to support more food, clothing, shelter, democracy, justice, economic prosperity, and education for people in other countries. However, in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories, Israel uses American money to increase hunger, house demolition, refugees, ethnic cleansing, military dictatorship, apartheid, torture, unemployment, and poverty. We give money to Israel unconditionally, without requiring or getting any accounting, unlike other countries we give foreign aid to. So even if Israel commits war crimes or ignores international law, we keep giving it money. Israel is one of the 20 wealthiest nations in the world. It has the 4th most powerful army in the world, and plenty of nuclear weapons. Its apartheid, military dictatorship, and ethnic cleansing policies oppress and impoverish Palestinians. Its policies destabilize the Middle East, making Israelis and Arabs and everyone else in the world less secure and more subject to violence. Israel withholds food, destroys the environment and shelter, keeps school children from getting an education, and refuses to end its occupation. As long as that happens, Palestinians cannot have a democratic state where all people are equal citizens with a viable economy. Therefore, if we give Israel money, we're violating not only our Foreign Assistance Act, but one of our basic values, the belief that there should be one standard of fairness, equality, and treatment for all people.